Dr. DC podcast. My name is Dr. DC, and sitting nowhere near me at all is producer Richard. It's a solo dolo episode. Richard is in Hawaii. He's on vacation yet again. He's such a fucking slacker. I think his feelings are hurt because he didn't win Outstanding Production at the Canadian Podcast Awards, and now he's fled the country to like an objectively worse country, and maybe he might be stuck there now. I got to imagine Hawaii is like a decent part of the country to be. But hopefully he's taking in all of the scenic goat graveyards that he took in last year. Go check out our episode on Patreon if you didn't hear that story. But while he's doing that and gallivanting out in the sun, I have a sacred responsibility to uphold here, and that is to continue the mission of Danuary. We've had 2 episodes already that are Dan adjacent or Dan centered, and this week is no exception. This week for Danuary, we're talking about the characters in DC. Oh, hang on. The characters in DC who are named Dan. You go, hey, are we launching right into it? And I go, no, nay, because there's still more of the intro. Each week, we discuss the weird and wonderful world of DC while fielding questions from listeners like you. And honestly, it feels like I haven't done this in 6 weeks. I know that's not true. We've had episodes out. You've been listening to them. But for some reason, I just feel supremely disconnected from being able to do this intro. I'm busier than I've ever been, I think, just in terms of amount of time I'm spending on things and stuff like that. And my brain is absolutely fried. But that means that I'm in the perfect headspace for Danuary, I think. So, like I said, we're talking about characters named Dan. There's actually quite a few. We got a bunch of questions, so let's just get into this, shall we? First up, we're heading on over to Instagram. Now we're going to Instagram, take some questions and answer them. And on Instagram, our first question comes from Zaravia CC. Oh, Zaravia CC. We'll workshop that one. I don't want to get too proud of stuff because Richard just comes back from vacation and makes me feel bad. So I guess we'll just wait and see how that goes. Zaravia asks, we all know who Marvel's best Chris is, but who is DC's best Dan? Yeah, I mean, listen, Marvel's best Chris is Chris Evans. Absolutely. But the best Chris is Chris Pine, a DC boy. So I just want to throw that out there first of all. But who is DC's best Dan? Well, there's so many. There's Dan Garrett, the first Blue Beetle. There's Dan Cassidy, the Blue Devil. There's Daniel West, the New 52 Reverse Flash. There's Danny the Street. There's Dan Turpin. There's a ton of Dans. Who is DC's best Dan? Well, I guess I'm also going fictional with this too. You know, like the question is who's Marvel's best Chris, and that's not about characters. So if we're saying who's DC's best Dan, then I guess we're going through like Daniel Samperi, like Dan DiDio. Like, are we going through Dan Mora? Are we going through those Dans? Who's DC's best Dan? I'm gonna go out there and say it's Danny the Street. I mean, you can't beat a sentient location. It's just such like a fun idea, and I love how Danny can communicate through like the shop windows and like the features of the street. I don't know. It's just such a fun idea. I gotta go I gotta go Danny the Street, I think, for DC's best Dan. All right, next question comes from Ethan Olejnizak, who writes, do you think Dan Dreiberg is a good person? I always liked him best when I read Watchmen as the most normal and heroic of the team, but as I've gotten older, I think his compromise in the end takes away his ability to be considered good. Yes, Dan Dreiberg, so in Watchmen, Dan Dreiberg is the second Night Owl. He's like the former partner of, like crime fighting partner, I should say, of Rorschach. He's played by Patrick Wilson in the movie. Yeah, I mean, I think you're hitting the nail on the head, which is that the point of that character is well, I mean, the point of all of them is that they are like so deeply inherently flawed, right? We're deconstructing just the idea of heroism, you know. The thing with Dan that you pointed out is that he does compromise. He as soon as the government goes, you guys all have to retire or whatever, he's not the only one to retire, but he has that whole exchange with Rorschach where he's talking about the good old days, what happened to them, and Rorschach says, you gave up, like you retired, whatever. And part of the thing there too is he compromised because it was easy. But we know that it's not what he thinks he should have done. He has like a physical impotency as Dan Dreiberg that he only solves when he is Night Owl again. He obviously yearns for the old days. He still keeps all of his stuff. He's got his old, like Archie. He's got his old like vehicle. He's got his old suit. He goes to like reminisce with the first Night Owl. Like, he keeps going to visit him and stuff, and like, yeah, there's a side of it where it's like that's just him maintaining a nice relationship with a mentor, but it's also that like all he can do is relive glory days or hear other people relive glory days. He has no real life, and the moment that he actually starts living again is when Laurie comes back into his life, and they start off normal enough, just going out having dinner, but like really all that does is suck him back into the life that he wanted. Now, some of that is, it's not necessarily about heroism there, but I do think there's a kind of symbolically that he only ever mattered as Night Owl, really. And he knows that, and he gave up too easy, and he basically leaps at the chance to be Night Owl again. And for a brief moment in time, he kind of gets everything back, and he's back in the swing of it, and he's on this mission, and they're like really going for it. And then as soon as he's confronted with the reality of what Ozymandias has done and the opportunity to basically like, quote, win at heroism by preserving this lie to maintain this fake world peace that Ozymandias has created, he does it right away. Like there's no, I think you can make philosophical arguments or moral arguments that, maybe it is worth the lie if it keeps people safe for stuff like that. We don't in the text itself have enough of a follow-up to know what the result of that is. The two kind of ostensible sequels to Watchmen, Doomsday Clock and the Watchmen HBO show, more or less say that lie won't hold up forever and things will go back to being bad again in some way. But yeah, Dan right away gives in, and almost with no even eye for consequence for Ozymandias, right? And Dr. Manhattan does the same thing, but he theoretically he's seeing the big picture or something like that. But yeah, Dan, yeah, he's sort of cowardly. He's lazy's the wrong word, but he he's taking the easy road because he thinks that that's the same as heroism, and it's not necessarily. So I think you're right. I think the realization that you're having as you're going back and reading Watchmen is absolutely intentional. You're not supposed to look at Dan Dreiberg and be like, that guy's got it figured out. You're supposed to look at a guy that like doesn't know who he is, what he stands for. He's got no backbone. He's kind of a mess, really. I mean, in the way that a lot of those characters are. But yeah, he's an absolute mess. All right, next question from Moonbeam19, who asks, why is Danny the Street the best character in the DC universe? And why does DC continue to tease Shadowpact in every crowd shot, but refuse to give them a new series? So, one thing at a time here. So Danny the Street, who I mentioned already, Danny the Street is a sentient location, a sentient location that can teleport around the world and take different forms. Danny has been a brick, an ambulance, a world. Danny has been comics. Danny has been many things. Yeah, God, there's a lot about Danny. So first of all, Danny is is gender fluid, which is I think it's such a great. What I love about that is anyone that is maybe tempted to complain, you think a place is like gender binary or like gender conforming. I kind of love that because you sort of deconstruct it. You go like, why should a place be? And then you sort of go, why should a person be? There's not really a good reason for it. It's sort of arbitrary. So I kind of like it as a literary device that way. The thing that I love about Danny is he's very expressive. He can communicate and show his mood and stuff through like the street itself. So like what's hanging in shop windows or signs that are on the street or stuff like that is all like dynamic and changing and stuff like that. I think that's really cool. It's just like a fascinating idea too. Like what is Danny? Like what type of being is Danny? And you sort of just go like, just Danny is Danny. We never really get into it more than that. And I kind of love that too. Anything with the Doom Patrol just in general is great. And that's where Danny is from the Doom Patrol corner of DC. Yeah, just like a grand old time. If you watch the Doom Patrol show, Danny is on the show. And that's very, very cool. But yeah, just a great character, a cool idea, often very well executed. Just interesting, just neat. The second question here, when you have crowd scenes, you do tend to artists will group characters by like team affiliation sometimes. So it's like, I know I've drawn Dick here, so I'll also draw Corey, and I'll draw Raven, and I'll draw Garfield or whatever. Same sort of thing applies here. But the question is about a team called the Shadowpact. Now, the Shadowpact is Dan adjacent because it was a team of sort of magical B-listers or lower. And one of the members of that team was Daniel Cassidy, the Blue Devil. They first teamed up during Day of Vengeance in the lead up to Infinite Crisis. That's a book I've talked about a lot on this podcast. It was a great team. It was Blue Devil and Black Alice and Detective Chimp and Nightshade and Nightmaster and Enchantress and Ragman. It was a cool team. They like teamed up to fight the fucking Spectre, all these kind of like nobodies, and that was kind of cool. And then they did get their own book after Infinite Crisis. There was a Shadowpact book. I think the short answer to why the Shadowpact isn't getting their own book again is that DC kind of perfected the idea when they made the Justice League Dark, which is, what if we took that idea of the Shadow Pact and we can even take some of the characters from it, but we'll also we'll make them not the underdogs anymore. The Justice League Dark, you get Dr. Fate, Swamp Thing, Zatanna, Constantine, but you could also get Detective Chimp, Ragman, the Blue Devil, they kind of perfected the idea with Justice League Dark, and I have a hard time imagining. I shouldn't say I have a hard time imagining. I think if you're going to bring the Shadow Pact back, you sort of have to. You got to give it just a little reinvention. Why is it important for B-listers to make B-list Magic characters to make a team? In the case of Infinite Crisis, it was because the big guns were too big of a target for the Spectre. The Spectre wasn't really looking for the Shadow Pact, and so they could organize a resistance. The Spectre in that case had gone immediately for Phantom Stranger, Dr. Fate, Madame Xanadu. 3 characters that are easily Justice League Dark members or adjacent. So I think if you were going to redo the Shadow Pact, you'd have to have that kind of vibe to it. And at this point, Detective Chimp is actually too big of a character for that team, I think. Nightmaster is dead. Blue Devil, maybe not too big of a character, but was sort of on a loner arc for a bit, was the champion of Mira until it was kind of destroyed and stuff. Ragman, does some work with Justice League Dark, but is maybe still obscure enough that could be on a Shadow Pact team. But really, there's almost no reason for that team the way it was to show up together again. So yeah, I think that's part of it. Next question comes from Dan Send 007. So a Dan sent this in January? Incredible. Dan asks, I've read a lot of Flash comics, but I don't remember ever seeing a Danny West Reverse Flash. Could you explain him and how he differs from the other Reverse Flashes? Yeah, so Daniel West was the New 52 Reverse Flash. And what I mean by that specifically is that, post Flashpoint, the Reverse Flash was meant to be dead. Now, eventually, even in the New 52, we got a version of Eobard Thawne, and eventually, as we do with these things, we sort of, fold all of time together, and people just are who they are, and they remember stuff, and we sort of unravel continuity. But for a little bit there in the New 52, the idea was that Eobard was gone. And so there was this new Reverse Flash. So you may, if you're familiar with the Flash comics of the last, 15 years, basically, you'll know that there was a black Wally West was introduced during the New 52, which is like a totally normal, fine thing to do unless you're like some fucking chud. And then a bunch of people complained about it. And then the old Wally West came back, but not to replace the new one. So now we have Wally, which is like the original Wally West, the one who was the Flash for a long time when Barry had died. And then we also have Wallace West, who is Kid Flash. So Wallace West is the son of Daniel West, who is this long lost or new invented sibling in the West family. So there's Daniel West, Iris West, and of course Rudy West, which is Wally's father. So in the New 52 continuity, you learn that Daniel sort of was on a bad path. He had been to prison and stuff because he got in with a bad crowd, and he got in with a bad crowd because when he was a kid, his dad was abusive because the mom died in childbirth with him, and he pushed the dad down the stairs, and the dad broke his back and was paralyzed or shit like that, and Iris wouldn't talk to him. At any rate, he becomes a criminal. He goes to prison for a bit. When he gets out, it's in the middle of this event during the New 52 Flash where Grodd and the armies of Gorilla City are attacking, and the rogues are rescuing people, and they're using the mirror dimension to get people out. And Daniel West is one of the people that gets rescued by the rogues. And then when they get brought to the mirror dimension, the rogues like stick them up. They're like, well, we rescued you, so like give us a little something for it. They're like taking people's money and stuff like that. He tries to escape, and somewhere in this mirror dimension, there is for a reason I don't remember, there's like a Snowpiercer train like powered by a Speed Force battery or something. Again, setups of which I don't really remember, but it explodes. And if you've ever seen the design of the New 52 Reverse Flash, which is what Daniel turns into because of this explosion, it's like red, but he has all these like kind of jagged bits of armor. I mean, in a way, I got to imagine he's the design inspiration for the Dark Flash from the Flash movie. But those are meant to be like pieces of shrapnel from the Speed Force battery. He mostly had super speed. He would steal speed from other speedsters or people touched by the Speed Force. And that would help propel him backward in time. He was going to go back in time and fix his childhood or some shit like that. But he could also kind of like manipulate that metal that was fused to his body. He could like shoot shards of it and stuff like that. He was a little bit different from other Reverse Flashes that way. Ultimately, what became of him is he ended up on the Suicide Squad. And I don't remember what the creative team was, but I think it was in the book titled New Suicide Squad. He kind of like has a bit of a face turn. He kind of turns sort of heroic and sort of sacrifices himself to save the team sort of deal. But he died on the Suicide Squad, and we haven't seen him since. And I think that's pretty much where we're going to leave him. I can't imagine him really coming back, especially since Thawne is back. Zolomon is back. Zoom is back. I can't imagine there's much room for Daniel West to come back, but never say never. Someone might do it. But yeah, I mean, interesting design. He looked very demonic, which was kind of cool and neat. But yeah, kind of a short-lived character. Didn't really show up that much or do that much. All right. Next question. Next question comes from Doug Thune, who asks, which 5 heroes would you pair up with Blue Devil to make a Legends-esque team? So, this is almost adjacent to that Shadow Pact question in a way that I'm going to try not to use any of the members of the Shadow Pact because that feels like a cheat. So Blue Devil, again, Daniel Cassidy is like a Hollywood stuntman who ends up basically inside like a demon skin that fuses to him, and he is basically essentially becomes a demon. And has like a staff with demon powers and stuff like that, more or less. During the New 52, in a very weird move, they teamed him up in a like 4 or 5 issue arc with Black Lightning. And that was kind of a weird one, but let's throw Black Lightning on the team just to honor that weird partnership. I think I would want to throw maybe Animal Man on there because both Buddy Baker and Daniel Cassidy have like a sort of connection to Hollywood and that sort of thing. So Black Lightning, Animal Man, 5 heroes to make a Legends-esque team. So yeah, Black Lightning, Animal Man. I think for Blue Devil, well, this is sort of Shadow Pact adjacent, so I'm breaking my own rule, but I think Tracy 13, sort of a magical character. They're connected through the Oblivion Bar, which used to be run by Jim Rook, the Nightmaster. But they both worked there. So yeah, Tracy 13 maybe. So Black Lightning, Animal Man, Tracy 13. I'm going to say... Who else? Who else should be on here? I'm going to go with Blue Devil. I'm going to go with like the Ray, I think, just because I think it's fun. And the last character I'd put on that team, I guess, would be maybe like Batwoman. Batwoman sometimes has sort of magic adjacent adventures, but the team, well, Jefferson is a decent tactician, but that team could use a bat, I think, what this team I've assembled. So maybe Batwoman, Kate Kane. Excuse me. All right. Let's leave Instagram and head on over to Reddit, where everyone's nice and no one's ever mean. And we got a question from Arpit the Hero, who asks, did Dan Garrett ever join the Justice Society of America? If not, why? I don't think he ever did. So Dan Garrett is the original Blue Beetle, the quote Golden Age Blue Beetle, and then obviously there's Ted Kord, and then the most recent one is obviously Jaime Reyes. The idea of Blue Beetle is that, and this was true even in the Charlton comics, is Dan Garrett had the Scarab, and it did give him powers. It didn't go like full like anime mech suit the way that Jaime's did, but it did give him some powers. He could do stuff, and when Ted Kord took over for him, it's a whole thing that he couldn't get the Scarab to work for him. It just wouldn't bond with him. And so Ted became a different kind of hero. Like Ted is, you know, we talked about Dan Dreiberg, Night Owl. That's what Night Owl is modeled after, is Blue Beetle. Ted became like a gadgets hero. And when Ted dies in Countdown to Infinite Crisis, the Scarab basically finds its way to Jaime Reyes and chooses him, and it fully activates, or almost fully activates. And so for the first time ever, we see this full kind of mech armor version of Blue Beetle. But it was sort of, in a way, you know, it was going back to what the Dan Garrett Blue Beetle was, but then like upgrading it, you know. So at any rate, all that to say, you know, I think this is true, that I don't think it was established that Dan Garrett was like such an old generation until like post Infinite Crisis, like until we're in the Jaime era, because I think it was more like he was not more of a contemporary of Ted, but like they were closer together was the idea in continuity. And it's not until after Infinite Crisis, I think, that they kind of retroactively go like, no, like Dan Garrett was in like the 40s or whatever, instead of the 60s or the 70s or something. So I think that's part of it. I might be kind of getting my wires crossed here, but I feel like there's some kind of Elseworlds book or something. I don't know if it's the Golden Age or not, but one of those kind of books, I feel like Dan Garrett is like referenced or mentioned, or you see him or something like that. But I think in main continuity, Dan has not really ever been a member of the Justice Society. Even when they established that he was around during that time, I think they mostly established that he was around and operating alone. So they've never gone back and really like inserted him into like the founding of the Justice Society or stuff like that, which I think isn't necessarily a problem. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that's where that one stands. Next question comes from Ben5442, who asks, which Justice Leaguer would Danny DeVito play? Another great Dan, an all-time Dan, I would say, is Danny DeVito. I feel like the obvious one, I guess, you know, how much of a leaguer does he count as? But if you go from like the Justice League International era, I think Danny DeVito has to be Oberon. He has to be like the little surly friend of like Mr. Miracle and Big Barda, right? I feel like that's the that's the one he should be. He's got to be Oberon. I I don't know that I could think of another character quickly that I think he'd be better suited to play. Certainly not as as a hero, not necessarily as a Justice Leaguer. I could see Danny DeVito in a villain role, maybe being like the Turtle or something, like a Flash villain or something like that. Or you could even be like a version of the Scavenger or something from Aquaman. Like, I think there's some weird villains he could be. He could be fucking like Mattermaster or something like that against Hawkman. But like, I think Justice League wise, the only real fit for me has got to be Oberon. Next question comes from Cactuar David, who asks, who exactly is Dan Turpin? How come this seemingly normal guy got turned into Darkseid during Final Crisis? Also, has he appeared in anything outside of comic books? So, Dan Turpin is this like hard as nails, like kind of hard boiled Metropolis detective. He's kind of like, in a sense, he's almost Metropolis's answer to Harvey Bullock. He's this tough, scrappy, kind of older, kind of out of shape guy. If I'm not mistaken, he's actually a creation for Superman the Animated Series. Now, I might be wrong there. Dan Turpin might have already been a character, and maybe the advent that they did in the animated series is that they made him look like Jack Kirby. If you go and you watch that show, Dan Turpin shows up. He's Jack Kirby on that show. And on that show, in its real like climactic moments, Darkseid kills Dan Turpin. It's a really big moment on that show. So not a surprise in that sense when Dan Turpin also becomes the focal point of Darkseid's attention in Final Crisis. Now, in Final Crisis, the New Gods all kind of died, and they were reincarnating into mortal flesh and like burning them out. And Darkseid was basically incarnating slowly over the course of that book into the body of Dan Turpin, who was trying to fight him, but could only do so much. He is, after all, just a mortal man, essentially. You know what? They made him look like Kirby because he's from a Kirby thing. It might even be New Gods, or Forever People maybe, or something. Dan Turpin is absolutely a Kirby character. He must have been part of the Fourth World stuff, I think. But at any rate, all of that to say, Dan Turpin has always been sort of connected to the New Gods in some way. So not a total surprise that he becomes like a character to use when Final Crisis happens and it's all about Darkseid. It's all about the New Gods and stuff like that. Yeah, there you go. So that's it for Reddit. Time to head on over to the Docscord. Fuck. Always docs on the scored side of docs. Jesus, it's like midnight. I'm recording this. I've completely lost the ability to whistle. That's the worst. That was so bad. That was such a bad effort. Question comes from Bisexual Lad, who asks, do you think we'll ever see Daniel Hall, aka Dream, again, given recent developments? So we're talking about Dream of the Endless, we're talking about Sandman. Which side of this to tackle first? Morpheus was the original Dream Lord, Dream of the Endless, like the embodiment of the idea of dream, ruler of the dream realm. And over the course of that book, we basically set up that he's going to be replaced, and he's replaced by this character Daniel Hall, who was conceived and born in the dream realm, and so was innately tied to its powers and to that realm. Daniel Hall has a very convoluted genealogy, which we've discussed in other episodes, but a genealogy that connects him to Hawk and Dove, to Hawkman and Hawkgirl, to the Silver Scarab, to Ken V. Nelson, or no, not Ken V. Hector Hall, sorry, and to Lyta Trevor. A very complicated family tree ends up with Daniel Hall being born, sort of absorbing the powers of Dream, and eventually replacing Morpheus when Morpheus dies as Dream of the Endless. As far as I'm aware, the last time that we saw Daniel Hall, the last time we saw Dream, was in Dark Knight's Metal, the first of those events, not Death Metal, but in Metal. Dream shows up right near the beginning of that event and sort of gives a warning of some kind to Batman. But far as I remember, and I reread Death Metal not all that long ago, Daniel does not show up there. Dream does not show up there. Dream is conspicuously absent from the Night Terrors event, which even introduced the Nightmare Stone. This is a conversation I've had before. I know it's been happening on the Dockscord. It's like, if there was ever a time to bring Dream back into something mainstream, it would have been that. You know, the Sandman books were always connected to the DC universe. They feature like Mr. Miracle and Martian Manhunter. They exist in with DC stuff. Dr. Destiny is in there, part of it, but they've always been a little bit apart, and I don't know if there's a bunch of like weird legal maneuvering about like rights or permissions or stuff like that, if that has anything to do with it, but suffice it to say, he doesn't show up much. He should have showed up in Night Terrors and didn't. Now, as for when is the next likely time that we'll see anything out of the Sandman corner of the universe, I would say hopefully it will be a little bit, it'll take a little while. This is obviously in light of the like truly horrifying revelations about Neil Gaiman. If you haven't read that Vogue article, or Vogue or Variety, I can't remember, but you got to read that article about Gaiman. It's haunting. It's extremely upsetting. It's it's all about his like weaponized feminism, essentially, and how he used that. Oh God, it's bad. It's hard to even talk about. And really awful, because Gaiman was absolutely one of my favorites. And Sandman is a real like towering masterwork, and over time I think maybe we'll be able to go back and appreciate that again. But it's tough when he's still alive to reap the benefits of people enjoying that work. And yeah, it's just really bad. So yeah, the short version is Daniel Hall has not, I'd say, shown up enough, but also will not show up for a while, I think, if people are being smart about it. Next question comes from It's Only Just Dan Dunn. Another incredible Dan submitting a question here. And the question is Dan a good name for a character because it's unassuming or because it's cool? And I listen, I respect this question. I think in the case of DC, it's because it's unassuming. I think there's a definitive answer to it. It's because it's unassuming. I'm sure there's like a cool Dan name out there, but the DC ones are like Dan Garrett is pretty close to being cool. Daniel Cassidy is like okay. Dan Turpin is all right, but like you kind of look at these characters too, and they're all kind of, Daniel Garrett was the first Blue Beetle. He had powers and stuff, and he's also like almost totally forgotten. Dan Turpin, cool guy, but a weird adjacent, kind of, he's a human in a New Gods book. You know what I mean? Like he's also sort of unassuming. Daniel Hall is a mortal who ends up taking over as Dreams. Again, unassuming. Who was Danny the Street, completely camouflaged as a street, essentially. I do think it's not that the name leads the characters to be that way, but surely all these characters that essentially are unassuming or are forgotten or stuff like that, they all do have a common thread. I mean, not all of, there are characters that are forgotten and unassuming that are not called Dan. So let's not, I'll try not to bias it the other way too much. But I do think in general, the name Dan is meant to be like, when they say like mild-mannered, Bruce Wayne, blah, 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 like Bruce Wayne is like a name, you know what I mean? Like, I think the real mild-manner is like, my name is like Dan Thomas, like I think they use it to be more like a quote ordinary name, and then they get extraordinary. You become the Blue Devil, or you become Blue Beetle, or Blue something else, I assume. I think the name Dan is used to be unassuming, if I'm being honest. Now, I just want to be really clear here, because it's Dan Dunn, and I fucking love Dan Dunn. I don't think you're unassuming. I think if you were in the DC universe, you would be unassuming, but not in our universe, baby. No, not out here. You're a Bruce Wayne out here, baby. Last question comes from Butt Fart Butt, who asks, who was Daniel Dunbar and what was his power set? So Daniel Dunbar is called Dynamite or Dynamite Kid or something like that. And he was the partner of Tex Thompson, or the guy's name was like Thomas N. Thompson or something like that. Essentially, you notice Thomas N. Thompson, TNT, and then his sidekick was Dynamite, was this Dan Dunbar, and basically they are legitimate Golden Age characters. They're from the 40s, I think. They get charged with some kind of radiation, but they have opposite charges. So if they touched each other, shouldn't have phrased it like that, they get like powers for a little bit, like strength and speed and stuff like that. Almost like a Masi Menos kind of situation where they have to make some contact and then they can use their powers and stuff like that. Or like the Wonder Twins in a way, I guess. I think what happened with those characters, with TNT and Dynamite, is that in post-crisis, so sorry, I gotta back up here. Pre-crisis, there was a team called the Seven Soldiers of Victory that included Star Spangled Kid, Stripesy, Crimson Avenger, Vigilante, Shining Knight, Green Arrow, and Green Arrow's sidekick Speedy. I think post-crisis, when they were trying to sort out the timeline of things, Green Arrow and Speedy no longer could fit with the golden age of heroes. The Seven Soldiers of Victory are almost meant to be, well, they're contemporaries, but also maybe slightly older than the Justice Society. You know what I mean? Like they're kind of in that era. So post-crisis, Green Arrow and Speedy didn't really fit there anymore. Now, in the modern day, they've made them fit by it having been like a time travel adventure sort of thing. But for a while, it didn't fit. And I think what they did was replace Green Arrow and Speedy with TNT and Dynamite. So they were actually members of the Seven Soldiers of Victory for a bit in a sort of retconned New Earth era of DC after Crisis on Infinite Earths. But But yeah, I think they must have had actual explosive powers, like stuff like that. But they also just would get strength and stuff like that. And it's something to do with them being charged by radiation, as many powers are. But yeah, it was that they got opposite charges. One was positive and one was not like personality, but one was positive charges and one was negative charges. And so yeah, eventually TNT dies, and I think Dynamite maybe temporarily loses his ability to use his powers, and then he figures out how to do it by himself or something like that. But more or less, they were like team up powers essentially, which is kind of cool. But yeah, that's another Dan Dunbar. A member of the Seven Soldiers of Victory, a very odd superhero team. Well, that's it. That was the last question. Holy cow. Danuary just trucking along so nicely right now. And we're going to keep it going next week. You'll see the call for questions when it goes out. But when it does, reach out to us. You can send us an email, drdcpodcast@gmail.com, or you can hit us up on social media. We're Dr. DC Podcast, wherever you find us. Be sure to, subscribe and all that kind of stuff. So get our episodes like automatically in your feed every week. And of course, if you want to support us, it's a new year, it's a new us, and a new Patreon. So the old Dr. DC Patreon, the old Ghostfacers Patreon are going to be defunct, shut down at the end of this month. Move on over, if you haven't already, to our new consolidated Patreon. It's patreon.com/editpoint. And there you're going to find back catalog episodes of the Dr. DC Double Dose, back catalog episodes of the Ghostfacers Bunker Report, plus our new weekly bonus episodes called You Wanted More. And at the highest level, there's all of those rewatch podcasts that I've been doing with special guest hosts. We're almost done DC Review right now, going through all the DCEU movies. We're very close to the end of that journey. I've been doing those ones with my dad, which has been a lot of fun. But go over to, patreon.com/editpoint. There's 3 levels, so $1, $5, $8 level. They all support us. And you get some fun bonus content. But make sure if you're on one of those old Patreons, those are going to be done at the end of the month. Make sure you get over there and sign up on the Edit Point one so you don't miss out. And if you want to listen to us for free, I guess, and not support us, you can head on over to our other podcast and check us out. And that's Ghostfacers, a Supernatural rewatch. We're going through every single episode of the CW Supernatural. We talk about real world monster lore, behind the scenes stuff about the show. We're just wrapping up season 10 very shortly. Of 15, so don't worry, quite a bit of runway left on that one. But yeah, go check that out. And we'll see you back next week for the conclusion of Danuary. Adios.
All the superheroes, they always fight for what is right. Live with danger and adventure, they are men of might.
This was a Brain Freeze podcast.